On behalf of the Board of Vermont Community Foundation, I want to welcome you to the 2023 annual meeting and thank you all sincerely for attending this celebration and showing your support for the foundation and the great work we all do together. It's really good to see everyone here at the Paramount. Before I pass things to Dan, our leader, let me just express a few more words of thanks. First, a huge shout out to Shaylyn Dwyer, my predecessor as chair of the foundation, who will term off the board this year after 10 years of service. Shaylyn was a terrific mentor to me in this role and has been an enormously valuable leader on our board. She will be greatly missed on the board, but we're not going to let her get too far away. So let's give her our thanks. I also want to acknowledge our three newest board members, Tim Brigland from Thetford, who joined us earlier this year, Rich Holshoe of Brattleboro, and Alex McLean of Peacham, who have just been elected to the board. Please join me in welcoming them. Now I want to acknowledge the VCF's enormously talented staff led by Dan. And I'm going to embarrass them by asking all of the staff members to stand up for a minute so everyone can see who the heck you are. I will say this, your skill and dedication never cease to amaze me. You provide the vital links between our generous donors and fund holders and the communities we serve in Vermont. You are tirelessly focused on our mission. You provide the vision for our work and the hard work to get it all done. Thank you sincerely. I hope all of you have had a chance to read this, our annual report. It's an excellent document, and it provides an overview and a glimpse and some snapshots of the work we're doing in the past year. Dan's going to tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But continuing with my thanks, I especially want to thank the broad network of donors and fund holders who generously provide the financial resources for our work. It was close to $40 million in contributions last year alone. Your philanthropic spirit, your generous giving, your belief in our mission, and your commitment to uplift Vermont communities are the engines that drive our work. On behalf of our board, we thank you sincerely. So one more thank you, and then I'll sit down. I want to say special thanks to the members of the Vermont Community Foundation. You are the close to 200 community leaders who have served us for years and have just voted to change our governance structure and your own roles. With your support, the members of VCF will now move into a much more meaningful and engaged role as community advisors. This is a really important change. I think it will serve us well. It has been a very long time coming. And we on the board look forward to working with you more closely in your new role. And so now I'm going to turn things back to Dan and thank you again, all of you, for joining us.
Good afternoon, everybody. Are we making sure they got the mic switch? They put this thing on my ear because I sometimes walk around, although I may not quite as much today. So lovely to see everybody out there today. And for everybody, I want to say thanks for taking the time out on a beautiful day like that today to come inside, join us here, and hear a little bit about our work together. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Shaylyn Dwyer, Thank you to the board. Thank you to all the partners who are out here in the audience and organizations, funders, stakeholders, members for just being here and being partners and being committed to Vermont communities. I want to also extend my gratitude to the members for the vote on governance that was just taken. These are necessary to move the organization forward in some exciting ways. They're going to make us more nimble as we seek different perspectives and diversity in our governance. They're going to strengthen our fiduciary oversight of the resources we manage and bring more substance to the engagement we have with our community advisors. As Spencer said, these were important changes to make. I want to thank Eric and the Paramount team. It's great to be back in Rutland. I was actually here last week for a Vermont Council on Rural Development set of meetings, and it was just incredibly inspiring to see the energy and hear the optimism that is abroad in Rutland and in this community right now. I see Tyler Richardson from Cedar. I don't know if Logan Paluch is here. There were a few other folks who participated in those meetings. There was one panel in particular, Tyler was on it. There were two small business owners, Lakia, Logan, Tyler, and Mayor Mike Dunges, I don't know if he's here or not, were on this panel. It was just so refreshing, so optimistic, and so bright that, people who saw it and were talking about it for days afterwards. But one of the questions they got was, what feels different right now? Why does it feel different? And there were two responses that stood out to me that I want to think about for a second. First, one of the panelists said, what's changed is that the things we've been working on for so long are starting to come to fruition. And the second response was, COVID gave new urgency to the idea that we need to work together to build community. So I think about those two things together, the diligence it takes to stay focused on change over time and the urgency of what we've been through in the last 3 years. And I just wanted to say thank you for the inspiration that is embedded in those two observations. It's good to be back here, a place that very much feels like it's on the upswing right now. And within those messages, there's an embedded reminder that for all of us in this moment post-pandemic, that strength comes not from avoiding challenges or dodging challenges, but strength really comes from moving through challenges, and communities have done that in the last few years. And thanks again for making the time to be here. I know there's a lot going on. I know CCV is sponsoring the race at Thunder Road tonight up in Barrie. I hope we can get you out of here in time to make post time. I thought I saw Joyce Judy coming in. And before I get too far into the program, I want to start by recognizing where we are. Not just in Rutland, in the Paramount Theatre, but the fact that we are gathered here in the homeland of the Abenaki people, past, present, and future. We acknowledge that this land has been continually inhabited and stewarded by the Abenaki for thousands of years. We give thanks to all those who came before us and to the Abenaki people here today as we work to strengthen community in the place we now call Vermont. In making this land acknowledgement, we also want to recognize that the foundation itself, this organization, it's on its own journey to better understand race, inequity, power, and privilege, and to bring awareness and intention to their systemic impact on Vermont through our programs, our culture, and our operations. Ultimately, the story of our journey is a story of place and places, over time and over generations. Places not just hills and streams and lakes and valleys, mountains or village greens, cabins, condos, country stores, or corner bars. Places are also defined by people, living in relationship to those things and to each other. People who were on the land before, people here today, and people who will be born and inbound to our communities long into the future. Our journey together is about understanding and holding that continuum with curiosity and joy, the role of philanthropy, testing the idea of enduring and sustainable impact, and building community and connection with consciousness of those who came before and those who will come after. What we see is that connection, curiosity, and the enduring impacts of our work together provide an overwhelming number of reasons to believe in the direction and the potential of the communities we serve. This meeting is about sharing those reasons to believe and the nuts and bolts of that journey. So Let's get into it. There we go. Quick stats. Who are we as the Vermont Community Foundation as of January 1, 2023? We're stewarding nearly 1,000 charitable funds, ranging in size from $10,000 to $35 million. The most important number right here is 57.8, which is resources we have active in community. That's roughly $35 million in grants, $18 million in mission investments, and $5 million in programmatic activity. Now, to talk a little bit more about community in Vermont and our work, I'm excited to share this video from a good friend to us all, Senator Patrick Leahy.
Good afternoon. Marcel and I are so happy to be with you to celebrate the tremendous work you're doing for Vermonters and Vermont communities. Thank you for letting us join you this way. I've been so impressed by the work you do and pleased to have been your federal partner on so many projects. Well, the Paramount Theatre, where you gather today, is just one example of the tremendous work we can do. We leverage our efforts to support wonderful downtowns like Rutland and wonderful institutions like the Paramount. When I look back, I think of the many paths I could have taken when I graduated from Georgetown Law School. Like many of my classmates, I started in private practice. But unlike so many of my classmates, it wasn't at a huge law firm in Washington, D.C. It was a small firm in Burlington with a man, last name of Hoff, as a partner. Marcel and I were born in Vermont and we wanted to go home, and that man, of course, was Phil Hoff, who would go on to be governor. I didn't work in private practice very long before I became Chittenden County State's Attorney. And with Phil Hoff paving the way at a young age, I had the audacity to think I might run for governor one day. In fact, the night I was elected to the U.S. Senate, I had to tell Marcel, well, it looks like I might not be governor after all. She told me that was all right. And serving the people of Vermont has been the honor of a lifetime. But it's never one I took for granted. Whether it's securing funding to keep our downtowns thriving, or protecting our environmental treasures, or ensuring our young people get a good start in life, helping Vermont and Vermonters thrive, that's been my life's work. Marcel and I care deeply about our state and our fellow Vermonters, but so does the Vermont Community Foundation. The foundation has focused for years on closing the opportunity gap that leaves too many Vermonters struggling to lead better lives. I can't think of a better partner than the Vermont Community Foundation to carry forward our values. And in recognition of the exceptional work done by the Vermont Community Foundation, I wanted to announce today that I'll be donating the majority of my remaining campaign funds to establish the Patrick and Marcel Leahy Fund for Vermont, and we'll have it at the Vermont Community Foundation. This fund will continue our life's work, supporting Vermonters and their communities. Nothing would mean more to me than knowing this work can continue in our names. With a charitable fund at the Community Foundation, we hope to continue a legacy of making a difference in Vermont and to create an enduring source of support for people and for communities for generations to come. So thank you to all donors who contribute to the well-being of the state, and to the many, many nonprofit organizations, community leaders, and others who step up in a spirit of giving. Thank you for all the wonderful messages you give to us all. And Marcel and I look forward to seeing you. Enjoy your celebration.
So I grew up in Middlesex, Vermont, not far from Senator and Marcel Leahy's farmhouse. I can remember actually trick-or-treating at their house. Marcel was long on peanut butter cups, which always meant that she'd tuck a couple extra in the bag. It shouldn't go without saying what it means to partner with Marcel and Senator Leahy. They've been incredible over 50 years, kind and generous and resilient in the face of what we ask public servants. They've done so much for so long. And in so many places, the public resources that Senator Leahy brought home commingle with philanthropy to move us forward. And that moving forward comes in the form of the incredible service provided and delivered by nonprofit organizations in every corner of the state. It's humbling to be asked to carry a piece of that legacy forward. With them, as with every fund at the VCF, it's a gift of trust and partnership over time. Now, our mission is to increase philanthropy in Vermont because we believe in the difference it can make. Increasing impact over time is on our mind, and that means building a strong team. In 2022 and 2023, we've welcomed these new team members to the organizations: John, Alyssa, Evelyn, Jen, Jane, Don, Barry, and Maddie. Thank you for joining us and being part of the team. Growth in our shared impact over time is also reflected in this slide. Steady increases in dollars active in the community through 2021 and a slight decline in 2022. According to new data from Giving USA, overall giving in this country reached an all-time high in 2021, surpassing $500 billion, and declined in 2022 as inflation and a weaker market hit home. We were not immune, as our pooled assets suffered from some of those market and economic conditions, experiencing declines of 14% in the long-term investment pool and 15% in the socially responsible pool. Both tough, but a little bit ahead of what the S&P did broadly at 18% off. This year is off to a better start. Even with those headwinds, last year we still marshaled nearly 4,000 grants to 1,800 different organizations, totaling $35 million. That $35 million compounded our total cumulative grant making as an organization to $391 million since our founding in 1986. So that means at some point last year when the market was off, our total grant making since the year we were founded eclipsed our total assets under management. That means more money at work in communities over time than at work in the portfolio today, and I think that's an important moment for any foundation like ours. So time matters, but it's not just about total grants, it's about focus. These partners are incredible examples of what can happen when philanthropy stays focused. Let's Grow Kids, the J. Warren and Lois McClure Foundation, the Curtis Fund, and our component fund, the Vermont Women's Fund, among many others, but each of these meaningfully changing the system in which they work. Just this week, the final passage of a bill to provide universal access to high-quality childcare. What a remarkable feat. The future of Vermont. The reality of this moment, this upswing, the future of Vermont kids has almost never been brighter. The J. Warren and Lois McClure Foundation piloting the early free degree promise with the Community College of Vermont, an original program to offer a free associate's degree for every Vermont kid who engages in the program. Millions of dollars in scholarships through the Curtis Fund over the years. And the Vermont Women's Fund focusing on the economic impact of women entrepreneurs and women-owned businesses across the state. Each meaningfully changing the system in which they work because they held that focus over time. Now, the underlying economic experience of a community is also key to closing the opportunity gap in our view. 20 years ago, our board made a long-term commitment to invest a portion of our pooled assets in Vermont. When grants and investments are commingled in place and integrated in place, incredible things can happen. This portfolio of mission investments is now at about $18 million and includes housing, energy, downtown revitalization, food and farm, new ventures, small businesses, and entrepreneurship. I want to thank Lawrence Miller, who also came on in 2022 as a senior advisor on mission investments to help us implement this program and steward this portfolio. These are some of our portfolio partners, and these investments represent a commitment to changing circumstances in Vermont communities. And changing circumstances is what's necessary. If you were born in 1940 in this country, you had a better than 90% chance of, sorry, this is getting a little depressing. If you were born in 1940, you had better than 90% chance of doing better than your parents as you grew up. If you were born since 1980, the odds that you do better than your parents economically is basically a toss-up. That's the difference between progress that's the rule and progress that becomes the exception. And not making progress means we're losing ground. Losing ground has civic, social, and economic consequences. Philanthropy itself has work to do at every level to make sure we don't compound the disparities that exist in this country and in Vermont. We take that very seriously. We've been committed to these questions. In 2017, we designed the Opportunity Gap Framework to get at these root issues. In 2020, we pivoted to pandemic response, holding capacity in that moment to address the systemic conditions that risk compounding the opportunity gap and the disparities that are experienced across our communities. Across the state, that meant fostering entrepreneurship with incubators, accelerators, and maker spaces like the Hub, like the partnership at Cedar, like the Space on Main, like the Generator, Mercy Connections work, Launch VT, and many more. It means seeding new ventures and small businesses with mission investments in the Community Capital of Vermont and the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund's Flex Cap Fund and others. It means working in partnership with the Center for Women in Enterprise. It means sustaining watershed resilience programming, Lost Post Irene, and supporting Food Connects and Vermont Way Foods and other partners in our local food system. It means lowering the barriers to college and career training tied to good jobs in Vermont communities with the McClure Foundation and Curtis Fund. It means fostering a culture of service with the Serve, Learn, Earn partnership with a number of organizations. It means investing in racial equity programs through Ideal VT and DEI training for school and municipal staff through the Welcoming, Equitable, and Anti-Racist Communities Initiative. It means helping launch a pediatric clinic for new American families in the Old North End and providing tools to care for young kids and teens in acute mental crises in emergency departments across the state. It means partnering with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston on the Working Communities Challenge and the Vermont Council on Rural Development to really understand what's going on in communities across the state. It's meant partnering with the communications union districts on rural broadband access and with the Vermont Community Broadband Board to guarantee the acquisition of fiber for a timely rural build-out, making sure communities are not left out or left behind of that key infrastructure. In Rutland, it's meant VCF funds supporting News Story and their work in economic independence for survivors of domestic violence. The United Way of Rutland County buying coats for kids in the Welcome to Winter project. The Rutland area NAACP's launch of a BIPOC hair clinic that served more than 200 young people in Southwest Vermont and has become a key social enterprise and place of connection. Through Mentor Connecture, it means support for the coalition work with Vermont After School to implement the Vermont Youth Project. And with the Center on Rural Innovation, it meant laying the groundwork for the 2022 EDA grant to further the digital economic strategy for the hub here at Rutland, along with BRIC in Springfield and Randolph. Support for the Turning Center and peer recovery coaching with those wrestling with substance use disorder. Last year, roughly 5,500 young people came out of Vermont high schools. Across the state, more than 12,000 people completed recovery for substance use disorder, to give you a sense of the scale we continue to face, of the challenge we continue to face. It also means supporting dozens of students in the McClure Free Degree Promise at CCV locations across southern Vermont. And it means public, private, and crowdsourced Better Places funding to reimagine Depot Park right here in Rutland and revitalize public spaces in Poultney. This is just a snapshot of the work that is made possible by the alchemy of partners that are in this room, the constellation of partners that are in this room and abroad in the state who care about each other and care about their communities. For 6 years, and even in some cases longer, alongside our fund holders and community partners, we've been working on these questions: how to build systems less likely to leave people out or leave them behind, investing in everything from childcare to after school to food distribution to housing, conservation, entrepreneurship, broadband, and outdoor recreation. None of this happens without partners. Organizations on the ground, entrepreneurs, statewide organizations, fund holders, and of course, members of the communities we seek to serve. Today is about celebrating those partners, lives and careers committed to the needs of our neighbors, from Con Hogan's award winners like Jim Baker of Rutland's own Project Vision, to staff and volunteers at organizations across the state, to our colleagues in philanthropy and the funders who make so much possible. Every partner, every mentor, every donor, every teacher, every coach, and every organization leaning into this work offers us all a reason to believe. Now, as we look forward After the entanglement of issues and the acceleration of conditions in the last few years, we've adapted the opportunity gap frame to reflect that experience in these emerging areas. This is a flywheel for community vitality, the building blocks of equity, the skills and knowledge to be economically secure, a vision for communities resilient in the face of a changing climate, communities that foster health and well-being, and pursue civic structures that inspire confidence and adapt to changing circumstances. Our work to get these right over time and the initiatives and partnerships that flow from them offers yet another set of reasons to believe that the opportunity gap by place, race, and family background will narrow and our communities can be strong. To us, that's the definition of an upswing. There's, of course, a lot more work to do, more insight, more understanding. The work of making a difference is never done. In this wheel, you'll see for the first time that the Vermont Community Foundation carved out a portion of its community impact budget to focus specifically on democracy, trust, and community leadership. Civic decline doesn't solely flow from hyperpolarization. It also emerges in stable states where progress stalls so thoroughly and on the things about which we agree that it leaves the future murkier than the past. It emerges when people stop working together. At the end of the day, our work to close the opportunity gap and to build strong communities fundamentally relies on civic institutions that are strong enough to increase people's faith in the future and their ability to solve problems. In Vermont, it means respecting our past without staying trapped by it. And we don't know where this inquiry will lead. It's not up to any one organization to lay out that direction, but we do hope that we can help open up space to consider what might be both possible and necessary. So to help us better understand the intersection of culture and civic renewal, we're delighted to welcome the author, Shaylyn Romney Garrett. Shaylyn's work offers a fresh take on polarization, social isolation, economic inequality, and culture change. She brings an energizing and deeply researched message of hope during a dark time in America's history. With Robert Putnam, she co-authored the book, The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. This book offers a roadmap for how to reweave our social fabric. And she's a member of the Braver Angels Scholars Council, and she helped found the Weave Social Fabric Project at the Aspen Institute. We will, of course, forgive her for living across the river in New Hampshire. Our hope, though, is that you leave here with a few things, 3 things specifically. First, a little inspiration that puts a smile on your face and plenty of reasons to believe that our communities are on the upswing if we keep working together. Second, our gratitude for your partnership in building strong communities in the place we all love. And some thought-provoking ideas for how we can keep driving forward based on where we've been before. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to Shaylyn.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I have to say, I only live just over the border in Keene, so pretty close. So thanks for welcoming me here today. In a way, my message is going to feel a bit like I'm preaching to the choir, because community foundations are such a critical component in community renewal and community revival, as Dan outlined for you just now. But I'm hoping that my message will provide a bit of a broader context for the work that foundations and groups such as yourself are engaged in every day. So today I'd like to just tell you a story. It's a story about American history, but very likely it's one that you've never heard before. It's a story about how we got here, into the multifaceted crisis facing our nation today. For nearly 50 years, across party lines and with only a few short interruptions, most Americans have said that our country is on the wrong track. A recent study by the Pew Research Center revealed that Americans are broadly pessimistic about our nation's prospects. And the American Psychological Association reports that the future of our nation is a bigger source of stress for average Americans than even their own finances or work. How did we get here? I believe that until we can answer that question, we will be condemned to plunge further down an ever-darkening path. Coming to see our past more clearly equips us to gain mastery over our future. So the tale I'm going to tell you traces the roots of today's problems. I'll share with you an evidence-based story about how we've arrived at our current predicament, as well as some important lessons of history that contain clues for how we might get ourselves out of it. Our story begins in the early 1830s, when a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville was sent by his government on a fact-finding mission to America. At the time, the United States was a fledgling democracy, barely half a century old, and many nations still looked to it as a bold experiment. Tocqueville traveled widely, speaking to citizens, observing daily life, and examining the communities and institutions that made up this new nation, and what he saw inspired him. Americans were profoundly protective of the individual liberty that they had fought so hard for, but at the same time, they were remarkably good at coming together to achieve common goals. Wherever at the head of some new undertaking, Tocqueville reported, you see the government in France or a man of rank in England. In the United States, you would be sure to find an association. Americans had found a balance between the rugged individualism and pragmatic communitarianism, Tocqueville observed, a unique blend of cultural values that had built a vibrant, participatory, and, by comparison to Europe at the time, surprisingly egalitarian society. It was not just rights, but mutual responsibilities that undergirded American democracy. There were still serious blind spots to be addressed. Indeed, this was a nation built upon the violent displacement of Native Americans, the enslavement of African Americans, and the disenfranchisement of women. But imperfect as it was, democracy in America, Tocqueville felt, was alive and well. But were Alexis de Tocqueville to travel to America once again, further on in our national story, what might he find? Would America fulfill its promise of balancing individual liberty with the common good? Would equality be realized and indeed produce prosperity for all? And would cooperation, participation, and vibrant associational life be enduring antidotes to tyranny? Let's look at an end-of-century balance sheet. On the broad question of prosperity, things could hardly be better. On the whole, Americans enjoy a degree of opportunity, abundance, and economic freedom of which previous generations only dreamed. And yet, this prosperity has come at a cost, which any visitor to this nation could not possibly fail to observe. The poor may be better off in real terms than their predecessors, but the benefits of economic growth are highly concentrated at the top. Slavery has been abolished, but the ruthless reality of structural inequality still condemns many people of color to a life of intergenerational poverty, and women still struggle to participate fully in an economy that manifestly favors male wage earners. As a result, the American dream has been replaced by widespread cynicism about a rigged economic system. Meanwhile, in the cultural sphere, a philosophy of supreme self-reliance is common. The pursuit of unfettered self-interest is considered a laudable ethic to live by. Indeed, many of the cultural icons that dominate the American imagination are extraordinarily, even blindly, narcissistic. This drift toward self-centeredness in private life is matched in the public square. In politics, relentlessly promoting one group's interests at the expense of others has created a repeated failure of compromise in a nation more and more fragmented. The result is a hobbled government as democratic institutions strain under the burden of polarization. In addition to this economic, cultural, and political malaise, social dislocation is also rising. Sweeping demographic and technological changes have disconnected and reconnected people in countless ways, rearranging identities and communities and unraveling a shared sense of belonging. Loneliness, isolation, and despair are on the rise as traditional social structures give way. Worried observers, as Tocqueville certainly would be, use words like oligarchy, plutocracy, and even tyranny to warn of the dangerous reemergence of overlapping economic and political power structures that America's founding was supposed to have banished. Still others lament that the country is on the wrong track morally and culturally, noting that huge numbers of Americans have stopped believing that we're all in this together. Does democracy, they wonder, stand on the verge of ruin? Though it would appear so in every way, the nation which I have just described is not today's America, but rather a historically accurate portrait of this country in another era, at the opening of the 20th century, just 50 years after Tocqueville wrote his stirring depiction of a thriving democracy. The United States in the 1880s and 1890s was startlingly similar to today. Inequality, political polarization, social dislocation, and cultural narcissism prevailed, all accompanied, as they are now, by unprecedented technological advances, prosperity, and material well-being. The parallels are indeed so striking that the foregoing description could have been given word for word about our nation today. Looking back to a time Mark Twain disparagingly called the Gilded Age turns out to feel eerily like looking in the mirror. But this realization that we've been here once before begs the question of what happened last time our nation found itself in such a troubling state of affairs. Clearly, the doomsday prophecies and despairing anxieties of the late 1800s were never fulfilled. So how did we get from the last American Gilded Age to our current crisis? What happened in the intervening century? One way to answer this question is to examine trends over time in different aspects of American society by asking the basic question of whether things have been getting better or worse since the turn of the 20th century. In other words, over the last 125 years, since the last Gilded Age, has America been moving toward greater or lesser altruism in cultural values? Greater or lesser cohesion and association in social life, greater or lesser cooperation and compromise in politics, and greater or lesser economic equality. When charting the answers to these questions side by side, we see an unmistakable, even breathtaking pattern. In each unique case, the trend line looks like an inverted U, starting its long upward climb at roughly the same moment and then reversing to a downward descent within a remarkably similar time frame. Each of these trend lines represents scores of underlying measures of each different aspect of our society. Taken together, they show unambiguously that on the heels of the last American Gilded Age, America entered more than 6 decades of imperfect but steady upward progress toward greater economic equality, more cooperation in the public square, a stronger social fabric, and a growing culture of solidarity. Throughout the first 2/3 of the 20th century, we actually narrowed the economic chasm born in the Gilded Age, making progress not just only during the Great Depression or World War II, but for decades both before and after. In that same period, we gradually overcame extreme political polarization and learned to cooperate across party lines. We also steadily wove an ever stronger network of community and family ties, and our culture became more focused on our shared responsibilities and less focused on our narrower self-interest. In short, America experienced a dramatic, multifaceted, and multi-decade upswing. By the time we arrived at the middle of the 20th century, the Gilded Age was a distant memory. America had been transformed into a more egalitarian, more cooperative, cohesive, and altruistic nation. At this mid-century moment, our still chauvinist and still segregated society was far from perfect. But as the 1960s opened, we were increasingly attentive to our imperfections, especially in racial and gender terms. Our new president then described us as poised to tackle our challenges together. Ask not what your country can do for you, John F. Kennedy famously said. Ask what you can do for your country. At that moment in American history, the argument that collective well-being was more important than individual well-being was hardly countercultural. Over the first 6 decades of the 20th century, America had become demonstrably, indeed measurably, a more we society. But then, as this chart indicates, and as those who lived through this period know too well, in the mid-1960s, the decades-long upswing in our shared economic, political, social, and cultural life abruptly reversed direction. America suddenly found itself in the midst of a clear downturn. Between the mid-1960s and today, by scores of hard measures across multiple dimensions, we have been experiencing declining economic equality, the deterioration of compromise in the public square, a fraying social fabric, and a descent into cultural narcissism. As the 1960s moved into the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond, we recreated the socioeconomic chasm of the Gilded Age at an accelerated pace. In the same period, we replaced cooperation with political polarization. We allowed our community and family ties to unravel. And our culture became far more focused on the individual and less interested in the common good. Since the 1950s, we have made important progress in expanding individual rights, but we have sharply regressed in our sense of shared responsibility and community values. Over the past 5 decades, America has become demonstrably, even measurably, a more I society. Generally speaking, each of these 4 trends in economics, politics, society, and culture is recognized in the relevant scholarly literature, although they have largely been treated as separate phenomena. Rarely have scholars recognized the striking concurrence of so many different trends following the same trajectory over such a long period of time. And yet, when charted side by side, as they are here, it's clear, even to non-scholars, that these are not 4 separate, unrelated phenomena. Indeed, the data is so correlated to such an extent that by using advanced methods of data analysis, we can combine these 4 trends to reveal a single statistical phenomenon, one inverted U-curve that provides a scientifically validated summary of the past 125 years in America's story. This meta-trend is a phenomenon my co-author Robert Putnam and I have come to call the I-we-I curve, a gradual climb into greater interdependence and cooperation followed by a steep descent into greater independence and egoism, from I to we and back again to I. This broad trend has been reflected in our experience of equality, our expression of democracy, our stock of social capital, our cultural identity, and our shared understanding of what this nation is all about. Rebecca Edwards, a historian of the Gilded Age, observed that the lessons one draws from a period of history depend to a large degree on one's choice of beginning and ending points. What this I-we-I curve makes clear is that the historical period from which we should take inspiration today is not the 1960s. Looking back only that far has taken commentators down the road of nostalgia, leaving them nothing more than to lament some paradise lost. In other words, looking to the moment when the upswing culminated turns out not to be very instructive. Looking to the moment when it began proves far more fruitful, especially when the context of that moment bears such striking resemblance to the moment we are living through today. Thus, the lesson of America's I-we-I century is not that we should return nostalgically to some supposed peak of American greatness, but rather that we should take inspiration and instruction from a period of despair, much like our own, on the heels of which Americans successfully and measurably bent history in a more promising direction. This broad analysis teaches us that America has once before experienced a storm of unbridled individualism in our culture, our communities, our politics, and our economics. And it produced then, as it has today, a situation that few Americans have found appealing. But we successfully weathered that storm once before, and we can do it again. Thus, if ever there were a historical moment whose hopeful lessons we need to learn, it is the moment when the first American Gilded Age turned into what historians call the Progressive Era, a moment which set in motion a sea change that helped us reclaim our nation's promise. So what are some of those lessons? How, in another dark moment in our nation's history, did our predecessors manage to turn things around? And how could what we apply, what we learn from their legacy, to do the same today? Now, the story that I've shared with you so far is fundamentally a statistical story, shaped by insights gained through the measurements of trends over time. Remember, it's those inverted U-curves that turned us on to the idea that we've been here once before. So in looking for clues about how to create another upswing, it makes sense to wonder if there's something that the data itself can tell us. When we see a number of different trends all starting to move in the same direction at roughly the same moment, one clue we can look for is something that statisticians call the leading variable. In other words, which trend started moving in the right direction first? If we can determine which variable moved first, we might have a sense of what drove the others forward, and thus what we should focus on if we want to recreate a similar pattern. But this story is not just a statistical narrative, it's also a historical one. We also have the historical record to turn to for clues. We have the history of ideas, what people were writing and talking about at different times. We also have the history of events, social movements, economic shifts, innovations, elections, and countless other occurrences that shape how a society changes over time. When we pair the data with the historical record, we see that the leading variable in the story of the upswing was culture. What led the last upswing was a reinvention of our shared cultural values, what we thought was possible, what we believed was important, and how we saw one another. And this, it turns out, is a pretty surprising conclusion. Because we tend to have a bias in this country, particularly in the social sciences, that economics drives everything. That people are first and foremost economic animals, driven by incentives, not ideas or morals or cultural values. But going back to the clues we find in the data, while culture seems to be the leading variable, economics is very clearly the lagging variable. We did not get out of a downturn and into an upswing last time through economic or political solutions. The huge gap between rich and poor and the political gridlock that accompanied it began to change only after we turned the tide of cultural narcissism. What that means is that in order to successfully solve our economic inequality and political polarization today, we need to start not in the halls of power, not with legislative or even programmatic solutions, but instead in the places where our cultural values, where our beliefs are formed. The places we turn to for moral formation and meaning making, the stories we tell ourselves about our past, our present, and our future, and the everyday interactions that shape how we see ourselves and one another. Places of the heart, places of human connection. This is where we can begin once again to move from a culture of I to a culture of we, a change in our shared cultural values that has the potential to ripple out into every other aspect of our society. This is how we got out of our multifaceted crisis last time and into a multi-decade upswing, and this is how we can reclaim our nation's promise again. American culture during the Gilded Age was largely characterized by something called social Darwinism. In 1859, Charles Darwin published his theory that would ultimately come to be called the survival of the fittest, a description of how the natural world was organized. Soon, social commentators began promoting the idea that if competition is how the natural world is organized, then that's how a society should be organized as well. Only the strong will survive, and the devil take the hindmost. It's worth noting that Darwin himself did not subscribe to these ideas, but many Americans did, arguing that those at the bottom were somehow less evolved and deserved whatever leftovers they got. Cutting-edge science was mixed with age-old bigotry to promote the idea of every man for himself. Some of the first people to challenge these ideas were people of faith. A bold new generation of religious leaders began to critique social Darwinism by proclaiming what they called the social gospel. Protestant Christianity, like so many other parts of our society at that time, had become incredibly individualistic during the Gilded Age, emphasizing personal salvation above all else. But the preachers of the social gospel argued that community and equality lay at the heart of Christ's message, and that a Christian vision of society was not about gaining the advantage over the weak and vulnerable, but instead lifting, healing, and caring for all. It is idle to imagine that changes in our governmental machinery or in the organization of our industries will bring us peace, wrote Washington Gladden, a social gospel preacher. The trouble lies deeper. What we have got to have, if we want true democracy, is a different kind of men and women to whom duties are more than rights and service dearer than privilege. These moral leaders knew instinctively what we have just seen through data analysis, that social, political, economic change had to begin first as a change of heart. But it wasn't just preachers leading a moral awakening that prompted the last upswing. The cultural shift was also fueled by storytellers, writers who were working to reframe America's understanding of the past, present, and future. Both how much our nation had faltered in living up to its founding principles, but also how much promise lay in reclaiming those principles and imagining a future newly dedicated to embodying them. In 1892, journalist Ida B. Wells started publishing articles and pamphlets in which she presented an exhaustive account of the brutal practice of lynching and the cruel realities of life under Jim Crow. The way to right wrongs, she wrote, is to shine the light of truth on them. The stories Wells told put a human face on the problems that most white Americans were content to ignore. Though her pieces were never published in the white-run magazines of the day, Wells joined the ranks of many journalists who worked to expose the hypocrisy and brutality of the Gilded Age. Known as muckrakers, these writers produced vivid portraits of the human cost and exploitative, unjust systems, which pricked the hearts of their readers and prompted them to push for change. While some writers were chastening everyday Americans with stories of the injustice, inhumanity, and corruption that social Darwinism had produced, others were inspiring their minds with imaginative stories of the equality, beauty, and cooperation that could characterize an America built upon the social gospel. In 1888, Edward Bellamy published a novel entitled Looking Backward. In it, the protagonist falls asleep in the year 1887 and wakes up in the year 2000 to find the America he had known completely changed. The cutthroat competition of the Gilded Age had been replaced by cooperation and the individualistic winner-take-all mindset by a deep sense of mutual responsibility and mutual aid. Looking Backward was an instant bestseller because it was more than just a good story. It put forward a specific, hopeful vision of democratic citizens choosing to organize their institutions around collective problem solving and a shared sense of destiny. The social gospel called upon people of faith to do the soul-searching and repentant work of recognizing their own complicity in the crises America was facing. And it challenged them to stand up and claim their role as moral leaders in society. The muckrakers told stories that exposed the human cost of America's moral drift, and novelists imagined exciting new futures built upon a moral awakening, reminding Americans that they didn't have to take the structures and systems of society for granted. This nation, this bold experiment, could be whatever they chose to make it. Together, these cultural influencers sparked a movement. As the data I've presented make clear, as more and more people turned away from cultural narcissism and toward cultural solidarity, the effects rippled out into nearly every corner of American society. Which brings us to the last chapter of our story. How did Americans at the turn of the last century translate this moral and cultural outlook into actual, measurable change? How did they create new structures, systems, programs, and laws that bridged the gap of political polarization, reversed economic inequality, and rewove our social fabric? The answer might surprise you. They did it through exactly the same mechanism Alexis de Tocqueville had observed to be so important to America's founding. They started joining clubs. Wherever at the head of some new undertaking in the United States, Tocqueville had said, you would be sure to find an association. Citizens gathering together to achieve a common goal was a fact of life in the 1830s, but something that had fallen out of favor by the 1880s. But by the 1900s, associations, clubs, societies, federations, and organizations were once again becoming the places that Americans made democracy work. It was this coming together on a human scale that paved the way for a sweeping set of national reforms and innovations, many of which form the very basis of American society as we know it today. As congregations across America embraced the social gospel, they transformed into centers dedicated not just to worship, but to youth groups, scout troops, day schools, soup kitchens, athletic teams, and more. Meanwhile, young professionals started Rotary clubs, Lions clubs, fraternal organizations to support one another and serve the community, all of which brought lonely, isolated Americans together and rewove our nation's tattered social fabric. After Looking Backward was published, Bellamy clubs sprung up all over the country. In these and other countless little groups like them, Americans began experimenting with innovative ideas for how to solve problems themselves in their own neighborhoods, towns, and cities. As a result, they invented solutions that never existed before and that transcended the gridlocked left-right political framework. Successful ideas went viral and eventually bubbled up to create widespread change. New forms of municipal administration, publicly owned utilities, food and drug regulations, consumer protections, and even free public high schools are just a few examples of the innovations created by everyday citizens tinkering in the laboratories of democracy. After reading the muckrakers' harrowing accounts of life in slums and factories, educated elites crossed the tracks into tenement districts and started settlement houses, places where rich and poor Americans could come together in shared community spaces. Settlement houses fostered bonds of trust and understanding across class lines and produced passionate activists who were responsible for the creation of many things we take for granted today: child labor laws, the juvenile court system, public sanitation infrastructure, and even public parks, libraries, and playgrounds all came to be, thanks in large part to the work of settlement houses. As more Americans began to see the immorality of exploitative wage labor, garment workers, machinists, farm workers, and blacksmiths, and many others banded together through labor associations and unions. They succeeded in winning from their employers higher pay, safety regulations, and more reasonable working hours, which evolved into seminal government protections such as antitrust legislation, workers' compensation insurance, the minimum wage, and ultimately, Social Security. In the face of ongoing racism and segregation, Black Americans created schools, churches, cultural institutions, sports teams, and advocacy organizations which offered critical support as millions relocated out of the South during the Great Migration. It was this explosion of Black associational life that gave birth to the civil rights movement. And women's clubs, sewing circles, music groups, literary societies, mothers' groups, and neighborhood associations created new spaces for women to gather, to build relationships, organize, and flex their civic muscles, through which they slowly built a campaign to win the right to vote. No one party, no one policy or platform, no one charismatic leader was responsible for bringing about America's upswing as we entered the 20th century. It was instead an immense collaboration of everyday Americans just like you and me, living in a time of loneliness, self-centeredness, economic inequality, and political infighting just like the one that we are living through today. And they had, just as we do today, a choice. They could continue the corrosive slide toward a culture of I, or they could reclaim the latent power of we. History tells us how they used their agency. We are the inheritors of the democracy that they saved. But we are also the inheritors of an unraveling, a backslide that has landed us right back where they started. And so the choice presents itself again. Will we drift along with the downturn, or will we master the moment and right the ship? If we choose drift, the consequences will surely be disastrous. But if we choose mastery, we have the chance to reverse our course and write a whole new chapter in the American story. The conditions and specific challenges that we face today, though often eerily familiar echoes of the past, are of course different in important ways from those faced by the Americans in the first Gilded Age. And accordingly, the paths we follow and the solutions we create will necessarily be different as well. But I suspect that many of the characters, the heroes and heroines of this new American epic, will look very much the same. So the question is, where do you see yourself in this story? Maybe you're a moral leader, a person who can speak in terms of right and wrong with confidence and compassion, and shepherd others through the inner work that will change the way we show up as citizens and neighbors. Or possibly you are a truth teller, an advocate who can shine a light on injustice and call for accountability. Or maybe you're a visionary who can imagine a bold new future and inspire others to make it a reality. Or perhaps you're a gatherer, someone who can invite people in and create new ways of being together that bridge our deepest divides and blend our online and offline lives. Or maybe you're an organizer who can help citizens find their voice, find common cause with others, and successfully press for change. Or maybe you're a joiner, someone who steps out of loneliness and isolation by heeding others' calls to come together. Or perhaps you're a civic innovator, a pioneer who can experiment, iterate, and invent totally new solutions to our shared problems and see them through to becoming the programs and policies that will reshape our national landscape. Whatever your gifts and unique passions, there is a place for you on the right side of history. We have gotten ourselves out of a mess, just like the one we're in today, and we can do it again. The task will not be easy, but nothing less than the success of the American experiment hangs in the balance. As we look to an uncertain future, we must keep in mind what is perhaps the greatest lesson of America's I, we, I century. As Theodore Roosevelt put it, the fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaylyn, so much for sharing your research, your learning, the hope, and those important roles. And one of the things that we wanted to ask you to dig in, you touched on a little bit about the black churches and responding to racism and so forth, but when you talk about, the first 2/3 of the century being about the ideas of increasing sense of solidarity, right, and how do you come to terms with things like Jim Crow and some of the other racist issues that were going on at that same time, in those same periods?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's probably the most important question to address about this thesis of the I, we, I century, right? Because it is true that that first 2/3 of the 20th century measurably was a time when we were moving toward a greater and greater sense of we, not just in one or two ways, but in lots and lots of different ways, but not necessarily in terms of racial reconciliation, right? And there's a lot to say about this, so I'll have to just choose carefully to be brief, but I will say this. The progressives, who engineered this progressive era, which came on the heels of the Gilded Age, were not entirely, but largely themselves racist. Their circle of moral concern simply did not extend to people of color, and to a certain extent, not to women either. And so what that means is that all of these incredible reforms that they put into place, which actually pushed America into that upswing, had built into them the structural racism that we are now reckoning with today. And so in a way, the progressives sort of kicked down the road the work of racial reconciliation. And as part of doing that, what that meant was that essentially America's upswing had knit into it sort of the seeds of its own demise, right? Because when we ask the question, what happened to the downturn? Why did we go into a downturn all of a sudden in the 1960s? There are lots and lots of answers to that. There is no one thing that pushed us toward I in the 1960s, but one of the many factors was white backlash to the civil rights movement. So it's no surprise that the era during which we actually passed civil rights legislation was in the 1960s, after having done multiple decades of work toward widening the we. Vast majorities of Americans were in favor of the passage of civil rights legislation. But right after that legislation was passed, during that peak of American we, the survey data shows very clearly that within a matter of months, white Americans were saying, not in my backyard. It was all fine and good in principle, but when we actually have to implement it, not sure that I want to do that, right? And what that means to my interpretation is that we had done the work on the surface of widening the we, but that we hadn't done the inner work under the surface to actually come to see ourselves as part of the same we, right? And so when push came to shove, we tipped into this individualistic mode. Now, we can't say for sure whether the white backlash to the civil rights movement drove our broader turn toward I, or whether our broader turn toward I drove the white backlash to the civil rights movement. We don't know, but what we do know is that those two things are inextricably linked. And what that means today is that any upswing that we would hope to put in motion cannot avoid the question of full inclusion. That cannot any longer be something that we just save for later. It has to be at the absolute center of any reforms that we would put into place in order to see another upswing, if that upswing is going to be sustainable, and if it is going to get us to the fullest possible sense of we that we could experience as a multicultural democracy.
Thank you. You all are doing an awesome job. These questions are coming rolling in. We're getting a lot about social media and technology, and how does that play into all of this?
Okay, so it is true, right, that when we compare today to the Gilded Age, that one of the biggest differences is social media. Now, it's also true that when you look back at the Gilded Age, there was an explosion of new technologies to proliferate information, just as there are today. You also see in that period a major sort of emergence of distrust of the press and the media. The term yellow journalism, which is meant to imply untrustworthy journalism or journalism motivated for profit, right? That actually is a term that emerged in that period. So that there is a parallel there to what we're seeing today, right? And that is because, the media, the people who run media organizations, are not immune from this broader cultural trend toward competition, toward what's in it for me, right? And so we see this profit-driven journalism as really just a manifestation of this broader hyper-individualism that we are living through as a culture. But social media is a little bit different in the sense of just its magnitude as far as its effect on American society, right? But I think the thing that I want to say about social media is just that it's really easy when we look at a phenomenon like that to feel as though we are being acted upon in a way to sort of surrender our agency, to say, oh, social media has changed our society so much, we can't control it, only Mark Zuckerberg can, and we've got to pass legislation to make him do the right thing. All of which, the legislation part and the regulation part, self-regulation as well as government regulation is absolutely necessary, but I think that it's important that we don't surrender our own agency, right? Social media is a thing that we create through our usage of it. And so there is a component in which we have to ask ourselves, am I using social media as a tool for further division? Or am I using it as a tool to bring people together? And so that is the thing that we can control, right? We also can control agitating and advocating for government regulations or other things. But we have to ask ourselves, really, again, on that human level, what are we doing with these tools? And how are we reclaiming our agency rather than just saying, well, this just is what it is and I can't control it, right? So I think that's one really important thing to say about social media. It is a huge challenge, obviously, and there's no simple answer, but it really can start with us.
Thank you. We're getting also a lot of questions about the role that crises play and wars in these efforts. So how do you lay that in? And there was also a few that had this nuance around the military complex, gaining profits off of that. And so how do you reconcile that?
Okay. Let's start with the question of crises, which is actually related to the question of agency, which I brought up with the last question, right? So a lot of people, but not just people, actually, a lot of really good historians, when they tell the story of the 20th century, the way that they tell that story is, it was the crises. It was the Great Depression and World War II that really brought us together. That was when America rediscovered the importance of solidarity, right? And if the data that I shared with you is true, what that means is that narrative about the 20th century can't also be true. Because why? Because those trend lines that you were seeing started going in the right direction decades before. In some cases, 50 years before the Great Depression, the Civil War, right? We actually started moving towards solidarity long before those crises, and that trend continued for decades after as well. And so when you look carefully at the data, you can actually see an acceleration of the upward trend in the wake of World War II. So it did have an effect, right? But it didn't start the trend by any means. So that begs the question, why do we like that narrative, right? Why do we like this narrative that the crisis is what brings us together? In fact, when I was doing the book tour for this book was published in 2020, and I've spoken to lots and lots of audiences, and often the question would come up, is the pandemic going to be the thing that brings us together? Well, do we all know the answer to that now? Right? I think it's fair to say that as human beings, again, we like doing this thing where we surrender our energy, our agency, and see ourselves simply as little boats drifting on the waves of history, right? When in fact the reality is that we move towards solidarity when we choose to move towards solidarity. The fascinating thing about the progressive era is that there actually wasn't some huge national crisis that set this thing in motion. What set this thing in motion was people looking around and saying that I've had enough, and I'm going to figure out what I can do on my own doorstep to change this.
These questions are just rolling in.
Sure.
One of them was about Vermont being the least religious state in the U.S., and so we don't always have communities of faith as an organizing principle. Are there new forms of community that we should be alert to forming?
Sure. So this is a really interesting question for me because I moved to New Hampshire from Utah. Utah, New Hampshire, and Vermont are always at the top of the charts on measures of social capital. Social solidarity, social cohesion, community connections, right? But what's so different about those two areas of the country is that, of course, Utah has possibly the highest rate of religiosity in the country, and Vermont and New Hampshire has one of the lowest. Fascinating, right? And yet the social capital measures are actually the same. What's so interesting about religiosity, when you look at the social capital research, is that it's less about what is being taught at the pulpit and more about whether you show up at the church picnic. The thing about religiosity is that it has a way of bringing us together, right? Physically together in the same spaces. And if we structure our religious communities correctly or thoughtfully, it can be places where we come together across lines of difference, right? And so that can be just as true with civic associations. It doesn't have to be religious organizations. And also, I think that moral formation can happen in civic organizations just as profoundly as it can happen in religious organizations. A colleague of mine named Eric Liu has started something called Civic Saturdays, which is what he calls an analog to church, a secular analog to church. And in those Civic Saturdays, they literally create a situation where there's a sermon and there are rituals and there are church suppers, so to speak, but they're all around the idea of democracy as this sort of unifying ideal that we are organizing around and meeting around. And so no, I don't think that it has to be religiosity, but I do think that it has to have a strong dose of moral formation. And that can happen in a secular context just as much as it can in a religious context.
Thank you. Do you have any other countries around the world that you see as being we countries or being in that we stage?
You know, so analogous research to what I've presented here has actually not been done in other countries yet because this is pretty recent data that we're publishing, right? But we have presented this data, my co-author and I have presented this data in multiple different countries, and we hear from people in Australia, we hear from people in Great Britain and other places that actually their sense, scholars' sense, is that those countries have gone through a similar trajectory. So America's not the only one that's being deeply affected by this sort of storm of individualism. And so there are a lot of countries that are unraveling in really similar ways to America, and that unraveling seems to have unfolded over a similar time frame. Now, there definitely are countries in Europe that are famously egalitarian, like Scandinavian countries, and actually the measures of economic equality that we saw at the peak of the curve in the 1960s were on par with what you see in Scandinavian countries, right? And so Scandinavian countries tend to do equality really well. They don't tend to do diversity and inclusion very well. They haven't figured that piece out yet. So those are societies that that historically have not been as multicultural as America, but are now being forced to be multicultural, and we don't know what the outcome of that is gonna be. We don't know if it's gonna be harder to share if I'm sharing with people who don't look like me.
Yeah.
And that's the problem that America is constantly grappling with.
And there were a number of questions related to that. There's also a few questions about capitalism and the role that capitalism plays, as well as a number of folks moved over into entrepreneurship and seeing that as really sort of an individualistic sort of activity. I've got this great idea. So how do we sort of go outwards from that, from this idea of the I and the entrepreneur into sort of the we?
Well, you know, one movement is social entrepreneurship, right? Which actually starts to take the tools of entrepreneurship, which is sort of a quintessentially American activity, but actually apply those tools to the question of solving social problems, right? So the question is, how can we take those economic engines and use them not just to enrich ourselves, but use them to enrich our communities, right? It's not that, you know, entrepreneurship or making money is bad, right? It's when we're only in it for making money, especially at the expense of others, that we're fueling this downturn toward I. So I think that is definitely something that we can, again, harness to move in a better direction. The question of capitalism is a lot stickier, right? Because so much of capitalism as America has experienced it is bound up with race and with sort of white privilege and power. And those are things that we are beginning to unpack. But I will tell you this, that I don't think anything is going to change in America's experience of capitalism until we do the work of that change of heart, right? We can't expect our systems to recreate themselves in an image other than our own. So the work starts right in here. When we want to change big systems like capitalism with a capital C, we need to ask ourselves whether we have done the work to think about whether we believe that we're all in this together, or whether we believe this is one giant competition.
Folks are looking for sort of those next steps. So whether you're looking at somebody who's really dug in and doesn't want to give up that I mentality, or if we're looking at, in Vermont, like a supermajority that's using the supermajority, maybe to not let others with different of opinions to testify or to have that space. So how do you get others on board? So you've done the deep looking inside, and you see where you are. How do you bring others who maybe are not quite there yet? Or are there any hints or policies or pieces that you've seen work?
Yeah, to that question I would say, I think we need to give up our addiction in this country to seeing everything through a political lens. Politics has become our religion. As we have walked away from organized religion, we have walked into organized politics, and we have asked politics to give our lives and our communities meaning in the way that religion used to. And that is a dangerous thing, when my political orientation becomes an identity so deep that I feel it with religious fervor. Because what happens then is I start to look at people who disagree with me politically as morally inferior, right? And when we get to that place, it's over. That's when we get to civil war. So I want to make clear that rates of polarization, political polarization in this country, have never been higher, with the exception of the Civil War. Let me just restate that one more time. We have never been more politically polarized than we are today, with the exception of when it came to bloodshed. Something has got to change. And I think that when you ask the question of where do we start at the level of the human, not at the level of the political, right? Because it's like, oh, how do I convince that other person to follow my political leanings? Like, no, right? No, right? We need to start as neighbors. We need to start as fellow citizens. We need to start in conversation, not conversation about political issues, conversation about the soccer team, conversation about, what you do on the weekends, conversation in which we get to know each other on a human scale, because once you do that, it actually makes it nearly impossible to otherize. And so then we can get to the conversations about politics once we actually see each other as fellow humans. But we won't see each other as fellow humans as a thought exercise. It actually has to be an interaction exercise. So what that means in practice is, if you don't know the first names of your neighbors, as 40-some% of Americans don't, go meet them this weekend. Introduce yourself and start with names, and then see where you can go from there. Because we are isolated from each other on that level, where we don't even know anything about the person living 50 feet away from us. We can't bridge our political divides if we can't bridge the divide of our backyard fence.
I don't know if we could end on a better question and a better answer than that. Thank you all for sharing your questions. There will be copies of Shaylyn's book out front. She'll be around to sign them as well.
Thank you, Shaylyn. Thank you, everybody. So remember 3 things. Hope you're taking away a little inspiration that puts a smile on your face. Our gratitude for your partnership. The Upswing starts right here, the relationships we have with each other and the work we all do together in Vermont communities. And some thought-provoking ideas for how we can keep driving forward based on where we've been before. So some quick logistics as we wrap up. There are some books for sale in the lobby, and I want to specifically thank Phoenix Books right around the corner here in Rutland, also up in Burlington, in Essex, a number of other communities around. And thanks to the owner, Renee Reiner, a good friend of the foundation. I think Renee's here somewhere in the audience today. Thank you very much, Renee. Caitlin will be signing the books. I'm going to invite Renee up for a moment. You're welcome. Good, Renee.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Renee Reiner, co-owner of Phoenix Books. And I would like to say that I will personally match all the gross book sale amount from this afternoon's sale. As a donation to the VCF, as a gift. Just saying.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It was a good idea. It was a good idea.
So,
Buy every copy.
so as Renee said, she's going to match every book that's sold at Phoenix Books this afternoon with a gift to the Community Foundation to advance our work. So thank you very much, Renee. You're a wonderful friend. And last but not least, thanks to the Paramount Theatre for hosting us, being one of those places where people can come together and share an experience. Thanks to Roots, the restaurant across the street, for the wonderful food we're about to enjoy. I think that about covers it. I'm looking at Kim to make sure I get a thumbs up. Thank you to Kim and Zoe for pulling together a wonderful event. And it's so awesome to see you. I look forward to connecting in a reception. Thank you for making the trip, no matter how far it came or how close you were already. It's really wonderful to see you all and sharing this work of building strong communities in Vermont. Thank you so much, and thank you so much.